The document was 47 pages long. It contained no speculation, no estimates, no hedged language designed to soften a conclusion. It was the product of 9 years of deep space sensor analysis, 3 independent verification teams, and the combined computational modeling of Ares, the adaptive response and early warning system, which humanity had built precisely because the universe had proven, through first contact alone, that it was not empty. The document had a title: Predicted Trajectory and Estimated Timeline of the Varith Expansion Front. Admiral Lena Vasquez had read it 4 times. Each time she arrived at the same number, the same date, the same geographic scope, and the same conclusion that her analysts had arrived at independently, without collaboration, in separate facilities on 3 different continents. The Varith weren't migrating. They were consuming. The distinction mattered enormously. When humanity had first encountered the Galactic Council, a loose confederation of 11 sentient species that had been in contact with one another for roughly 3,000 years, the welcome had been cautious but genuine. Humanity was new. Humanity was young. Humanity was, by nearly every measurable metric the Council used, a minor power with no fleet to speak of and a defense posture that was still, charitably, developing. The Council had given Earth observer status. A seat at the table but not a vote. A voice, but one that carried the weight of a species that had only recently stopped fighting wars with itself over ideology and territorial borders that, from orbit, looked almost comically small. Earth had accepted that arrangement. It had no leverage to demand otherwise. But Earth had also done something the Council species had never quite understood. It had kept watching, kept listening, kept running the numbers on things the Council had classified as resolved, settled, or simply not worth the diplomatic cost of revisiting. The Varith were one of those things. To the Council, the Varith were a known quantity. A nomadic biological superorganism, not a civilization in the traditional sense, but a distributed intelligence spread across a vast fleet of organic ships, capable of consuming planetary biosystems and converting them into biomass to sustain and expand the fleet. The Council had encountered them twice in recorded history. Both times, the Varith had moved through regions the Council species had no interest in defending. Both times, the Varith had passed, consumed, and moved on without engaging any protected world. The Council's official position was simple: the Varith were a natural phenomenon. Dangerous, yes, but manageable, predictable, and, most critically, not currently a threat to any Council-protected world. Admiral Vasquez's document said otherwise. She sat in the Geneva briefing room with her 3 senior analysts, Dr. Priya Anand, Commander Yusuf Merrick, and Dr. Hannah Sato, and looked at the holographic trajectory map that the Ares system had generated based on 9 years of sensor data collected from humanity's deep space relay network. The Varith front was not moving in the direction the Council had projected. It had changed course approximately 12 years ago, a shift so gradual that it registered as noise in the Council's older monitoring systems. Humanity's newer network, designed specifically to track non-standard movement patterns across deep space, had caught it, cross-referenced it, and confirmed it across 17 independent data points. The new trajectory brought the Varith expansion front toward the Shira Arm, a dense, biologically rich region of space that contained, among other things, 4 Council-protected worlds and 3 inhabited systems that had applied for Council membership but had not yet received it. It also, depending on the exact corridor the front selected, brought it within 2 light-years of Sol. "We present this to the Council in 6 days, Vasquez said. Her voice was steady. She'd had time to process the fear and move through it into something colder and more useful. "They won't believe us," Anand said. "Not pessimism. Just probability." "They'll believe the data," Merrick said. "They'll believe their own interpretation of our data," Sato corrected quietly. All 4 of them sat with that for a moment. Vasquez closed the holographic display. "We present anyway. We document the presentation. We document their response. And we begin preliminary defense planning regardless of their decision." "On what authority?" Merrick asked. "Earth Unified Defense Command has sovereign authority over Sol System and Earth colonial territories," Vasquez said. "That's our authority. We don't need the Council to protect our own space. And if the Council says our data is wrong?" Vasquez looked at the now dark space where the trajectory map had been, at the coordinates she had memorized, at the date that the Ares system had flagged in high-confidence red. "Then we'll be the ones with the defense grid already built when they find out it wasn't." The presentation to the Galactic Council took place aboard the Council's primary diplomatic station, orbiting the neutral world of Eru Prime, 6 days later. The chamber was designed to be impressive, and it was. 11 species, each represented by their senior diplomatic delegation, arranged in a curved amphitheater that had taken 300 years to design to the mutual satisfaction of beings who experienced space, light, and social hierarchy in radically different ways. The acoustics alone had required a dedicated engineering project. Humanity's delegation was 3 people: Vasquez, Anand, and Earth's senior diplomatic liaison, Ambassador Kaya Brennan, who had spent 14 years building the relationships in this room that gave Earth's voice any weight at all. They were given 40 minutes. Vasquez used 32 of them. She walked the council through the data methodically. The sensor relay network. The trajectory deviation. The cross-reference verification. The confidence intervals. The projected timeline. She did not editorialize. She did not use emotional language. She presented the analysis the way her team had built it, as a scientific document, sourced and verifiable, inviting scrutiny. The council's response took the remaining 8 minutes of the session, and then extended into a 2-hour closed deliberation that humanity's delegation was not invited to attend. When the council reconvened, the senior arbiter, a Durrani elder named Vasquez, whose species had been the founding members of the council and who carried the kind of institutional authority that comes from 3,000 years of unbroken diplomatic tradition, delivered the response with the measured courtesy that the council always used, regardless of what it was actually saying. The council appreciated Earth's contribution. The data had been reviewed by the council's own scientific advisory body. The trajectory deviation was acknowledged as a real phenomenon, but assessed as falling within the natural variance of Varith movement patterns documented over the past 2 millennia. The projected impact on council-protected worlds was evaluated as low probability. The council would continue to monitor the situation through its own established networks. Earth's warning was noted. Earth's warning was rejected. Vasquez listened to all of it. She did not show what she felt. She thanked the council for their time, confirmed that Earth's data and the presentation materials would be submitted formally to the council record, and walked out of the chamber with the quiet, unhurried step of someone who had already decided what came next. In the corridor outside, Brennan exhaled slowly. "They think we're alarmists. They think we're new," Vasquez said. "There's a difference. Does it matter?" Vasquez thought about the trajectory map. About the date the Ares system had flagged. About the 4 council-protected worlds in the Shira arm, and the 3 uninitiated systems, and the 2 light years that stood between the Varith front's outer boundary and Sol. "No," she said. "It doesn't. We go home. We build." The council's formal rejection of Earth's warning was logged in the diplomatic record at 1432, station time, March 9, 2219. Humanity's defense construction authorization was signed 41 hours later. The Varith front crossed the outer boundary of the Shira arm 19 months after that. It did not behave as the council had predicted. The authorization document that Admiral Vasquez signed on the flight back from Eru Prime was not dramatic. It was 12 pages of procurement language, budget reallocations, and technical specifications written in the deliberately boring dialect of military logistics. The kind of text that is designed to describe enormous things in the smallest possible emotional footprint. What it authorized was not small. Earth Unified Defense Command had been operating on a constrained budget since the formation of the unified government in 2187. The logic at the time had been sound. First contact had been made, the Galactic Council was a known and non-hostile entity, and the political calculus of a species emerging from centuries of internal conflict favored investment in reconstruction, expansion, and diplomacy over military buildup. The Council had, at various points, expressed mild concern about humanity's defense spending even at its current modest levels, a concern rooted less in genuine alarm than in the reflexive wariness that older civilizations tend to feel toward younger ones who seem, by temperament, slightly more comfortable with the idea of armed conflict. Earth had not built its defense posture for the Council's comfort. It had built it for this. The authorization document covered 4 major programs, all of which had existed in various states of planning and partial development for years, waiting for exactly the kind of political green light that a formal threat assessment, and a formal council rejection of that assessment, provided. The first was Sentinel Chain, a deep space early warning expansion that would triple the range of the existing Ares relay network by deploying a new generation of autonomous monitoring stations along the outer boundary of Sol's gravitational influence and beyond. These were not weapons platforms. They were ears, extraordinarily sensitive instruments capable of detecting the gravitational distortion signature of large-mass fleet movement across distances that no existing council monitoring system could match. Humanity had designed them specifically because Ares had taught its engineers that the most important military intelligence is the kind that arrives early enough to matter. The second program was Foundry Protocol, an acceleration of Earth's deep space industrial infrastructure. The orbital shipyards above Mars, Ganymede, and the newer facilities in the asteroid belt had been operating at roughly 40% of theoretical capacity for the past decade. Foundry Protocol pushed them to full capacity and authorized the construction of 6 new fabrication platforms in the outer system. These platforms were designed to produce the hulls, drive systems and weapons packages for a new generation of warships, not the patrol cruisers and escort frigates that made up the bulk of Earth's current fleet, but genuine capital ships. Long range, high endurance, built to operate far from any support infrastructure and sustain combat effectiveness for extended periods without resupply. The third was Shield Wall, a layered autonomous defense network for the Sol system itself. Humanity had learned, from decades of studying military history on its own world and from the limited tactical doctrine it had been able to access through Council archives, that no fleet, no matter how capable, could be everywhere at once. Shield Wall was the answer to that problem. It was a distributed network of autonomous platforms, sensor arrays, point defense batteries, kinetic interceptors and directed energy weapons nodes, woven into a coordinated system that could operate independently of centralized command. If a threat entered Sol system, Shield Wall would not wait for orders. It would respond, layer by layer, buying time for the fleet to respond. The fourth program had no public name. In internal documents it was referred to only as Contingency Framework, and it was perhaps the most significant of the four, not because of the hardware it authorized but because of the doctrine it formalized. Contingency Framework was Earth's answer to a question that the military theorists of EUDC had been debating quietly for years. What does a defense strategy look like for a species that cannot, by any realistic assessment, match the Varith in raw biological mass, numbers, or the kind of relentless attrition that a superorganism with no fear of death is capable of sustaining? The answer, developed over years of modeling and refined by the Ares system's combat projection algorithms, was not to try to match the Varith at all. The Varith were a biological entity. They consumed. They expanded. They did not retreat because they had no concept of retreat. The front simply absorbed losses and pushed forward, driven by something closer to cellular growth than military strategy. Against a conventional military force, this made them devastating. They could absorb casualties that would shatter any organized military and continue advancing. But they had vulnerabilities that biology always has. They needed biomass to sustain the fleet. They needed time to process consumed worlds. They were, despite their intelligence, fundamentally reactive at the tactical level. They moved toward biological richness and away from environments that offered nothing to consume. And they had no logistics chain to disrupt, but they did have biological nodes, concentrations of the superorganism's distributed intelligence, that served as coordination centers for the front. Contingency Framework was built around those vulnerabilities. It was a doctrine of denial, attrition and precision targeting, designed not to stop the Varith through brute force, but to make every engagement costly enough in time and energy to alter the front's behavior. To make the Shira arm, and Sol, targets that offered less return than the effort required to consume them. In military terms, it was a strategy of making humanity too expensive to eat. The construction timeline was aggressive. Vasquez's team had estimated that they had between 18 and 24 months before the Varith front reached the outer edge of the Shira arm. The Ares projection carried a confidence interval that narrowed as new sensor data arrived, and each new data point moved the estimate toward the shorter end of the range. They worked fast. The shipyards went to continuous operation. The fabrication platforms were commissioned ahead of schedule through a combination of engineering improvisation and the kind of organizational pressure that only a genuine existential threat can sustain over a period of months. The Sentinel chain stations were launched in batches, their deployment optimized to maximize coverage of the Varitha's projected approach corridor. Shield wall nodes were seeded throughout the Sol system in a pattern that, to any observer without access to the underlying tactical doctrine, would look like a fairly routine infrastructure upgrade. It was not routine. It was a planetary defense architecture that had no precedent in Earth's history and very little parallel in the Council's archives. The fleet grew. Slowly, by the standards of species that had been building warships for millennia. Quickly, by the standards of what Earth had been able to project 12 months earlier. 7 new capital ships were laid down in the first 8 months. 17 escort-class vessels. 42 long-range patrol and interdiction craft. Not enough to fight the Varith front head-on. No one pretended otherwise. Enough to implement contingency framework. Enough to make the doctrine viable. Enough to make Earth's position something other than a choice between evacuation and extinction. None of this was secret exactly. Earth reported its defense expenditure to the Council as required under its Observer Status Agreement. The reports were accurate. They simply did not include the strategic context that would have made their scale alarming to a reader who understood what they were looking at. The Council did not ask follow-up questions. Vasquez had expected that. The Council's attention was on other things. Trade negotiations. Membership applications from 2 new species. A long-running territorial dispute between the Durrani and the Keleth Compact that had been simmering for decades and had recently required mediated arbitration. The Vareth were not on the agenda. In the outer system, humanity's shipyards burned through the night shift and the day shift and the night shift again. The Ares system updated its projections every 72 hours. The date moved. Not backward. Never backward. Always forward and always arriving sooner than the previous estimate. 14 months after the Council rejection, Sentinel Chain Station 7 recorded an anomalous gravity signature at the outer boundary of the Shira arm. The signature matched the Vareth expansion front. It was 4 months ahead of Ares's most aggressive projected timeline. Vasquez received the alert at 0300 Geneva time. She read it twice, confirmed the source, and issued 3 orders before dawn. The fleet was placed on readiness condition 2. The shield wall network was brought to active monitoring. And a formal notification was transmitted to the Galactic Council. Not a request. A notification. Humanity was going to war. The EUS Carthage was not the largest ship in Earth's fleet. That distinction belonged to the Resolute, still completing its final systems trials at the Ganymede yards. The Carthage was the most capable ship Earth had operational, a long-range capital vessel that represented 5 years of design work, 2 years of construction, and every lesson Earth's naval architects had drawn from the Council's historical records and their own theoretical modeling. She was 1.4 kilometers from bow to stern. Her primary drive system could sustain a combat acceleration profile that no existing Council warship could match over a sustained engagement window. Her weapons suite was a layered combination of directed energy systems, kinetic delivery platforms, and what Earth's ordnance engineers called precision biological disruptors. Weapons designed specifically to target and degrade the organic systems of Vareth ship organisms without the kind of area saturation that would make them indiscriminate. The biological disruptors were the part of the weapons suite that had taken the longest to develop and that Vasquez was most cautious about discussing with the Council. Not because they were secret, they weren't, but because their very existence carried an implication that Earth had been preparing for this specific engagement for far longer than the Council would find comfortable. Which was true. Captain Rhea Park commanded the Carthage. She was 51 years old, a veteran of Earth's internal maritime and aerospace defense forces who had transitioned to the Deep Space Fleet when EUDC expanded its operational scope following first contact. She had the particular quality of stillness under pressure that distinguishes experienced commanders from capable ones. The ability to sit inside a crisis without being moved by it, processing information and making decisions without the emotional noise that compromises clarity. She needed that quality now. The Sentinel chain data that arrived at the Carthage's sensor suite over a period of 6 hours on the 14th of October, 2220, was the most detailed real-time picture of a Vareth front that any Earth vessel had ever received. 7 Sentinel stations were tracking the front simultaneously, their data synchronized and overlaid into a composite picture that the Carthage's tactical system rendered as a false color density map on the main bridge display. The front was not a fleet in any conventional sense. It was closer to a weather system. A slow-moving, incomprehensibly vast biological entity that occupied a volume of space roughly 2 light-minutes across and was advancing at a rate that, translated into human terms of reference, felt almost gentle, until you considered what it left behind. The Carthage and her 4 escort vessels, Indus, Tigris, Yangtze, and Lena, all fast attack platforms designed to operate in coordinated groups, had been positioned at the Shira arm boundary 3 weeks earlier. Their mission was not combat engagement. Not yet. Their mission was observation, characterization, and, if circumstances demanded it, first response. Park stood at the bridge display and looked at the density map for a long time. Biological node concentration, she said to her tactical officer, Commander Shin Zhao. Compare it to the Council's historical records. Zhao worked for a moment. Node density is approximately 40% higher than anything in the Council archives, ma'am. The distribution pattern is also different. Historical fronts show nodes concentrated at the leading edge. This front has significant node concentration at the flanks. Park absorbed that. It's learned. That's one interpretation. What's another? Zhao hesitated. That this is a different Varith front than any the Council has previously recorded. Either an older, more evolved instance of the superorganism, or a distinct biological lineage with different organizational characteristics. Either way, Park said, it's not what the Council modeled. No, ma'am. Park turned to her communications officer. Get me a channel to EUDC command. Priority 1. And prepare a full sensor package for relay to the Council. She paused. Flag it as urgent. The communications officer looked up. The Council already has an open channel request pending, ma'am. They've been trying to reach us for the past 2 hours. Park raised an eyebrow. Since before we had the full sensor picture? Yes, ma'am. Since Sentinel Station 4's first alert. She nodded slowly. That meant the Council's own monitoring systems, older, less sensitive but not blind, had caught the front's arrival. Which meant they were already processing the same surprise that the Sentinel data was delivering to her. Put them through, she said. The Council liaison who appeared on the bridge display was a Durrani, the same species as Senior Arbiter Voskereth, though younger, and without the elaborate ceremonial markings that the senior diplomatic rank carried. His name was Councillor Drev, and he was, Park recognized, the Council's primary military liaison, a position that had been largely ceremonial for the past 100 years. He did not look ceremonial now. Captain Park, Drev said. His translation came through a half-second behind the original sound, smooth but slightly formal. The Council requires a direct assessment from your vessel's observation position. Our monitoring systems are registering a Varith front entry into the Shira arm, but our data resolution is insufficient to characterize the front's current behavioral profile. Park looked at him steadily. Counselor, I'm currently compiling a full sensor report for relay to the Council and to EUDC command. I can have a preliminary assessment to you within 2 hours. The Council would prefer something sooner. I understand that. The Council will have something accurate in 2 hours, or something incomplete immediately. I recommend the former. She kept her tone even. Respectful. Not apologetic. Drev was quiet for a moment. The Council is reassessing certain earlier determinations regarding the Varith trajectory. I understand, Park said. The preliminary data suggests the front's trajectory is consistent with the projections contained in Admiral Vasquez's report to the Council 14 months ago. Yes, Park said. It is. Another pause. Longer this time. The Council would appreciate knowing what defensive preparations Earth has made, given the circumstances. Park looked at the density map. At the front, moving through the Shira arm with the slow, inexorable biological patience of something that had been doing this for a very long time. At the 4 inhabited systems in its projected path, 2 of which had no meaningful defense infrastructure. At the timeline the Carthage's tactical system was now generating, updated with the real-time sensor data, showing the first planetary system in the front's path had perhaps 11 weeks before the leading biomass reached its outer orbital shell. Counselor, she said carefully, I think it would be better if that conversation happened between Admiral Vasquez and the Senior Arbiter directly. The Senior Arbiter is requesting exactly that meeting. Good, Park said. I'll let the Admiral know. She closed the channel. Zhao looked at her across the bridge. They're going to ask for help. Yes, Park said. Are we going to give it? Park looked at the map again. At the 11 weeks. At the inhabited worlds. At the species in them who had nothing to do with the Council's decision to reject Earth's warning, and who would suffer regardless. We were always going to give it, she said. That was never the question. What was the question? Whether they'd ask in time for it to matter. The emergency session convened 48 hours after Captain Park's exchange with Councillor Drev. It was the first emergency session called by the Galactic Council in 67 years, and the chamber that had been designed to project deliberate, measured authority now had a different quality to it, the kind of compressed, airless tension that fills any room where the people inside it are confronting the gap between what they believed and what is true. Admiral Lena Vasquez sat across from Senior Arbiter Voskereth and 11 other senior representatives, and she did not say I told you so. She didn't need to. The Sentinel data that the Carthage had relayed spoke with a precision that made editorializing unnecessary. What she said instead was this. Earth has been preparing for this contingency for 14 months. We have a defense doctrine, an operational fleet, and an early warning network already in place. What we do not have is the authority to operate within Council-protected space without Council sanction. And we do not have the intelligence on the 4 Council-protected worlds in the front's path that would allow us to prioritize our response effectively. She placed a data package on the Council's shared network. This is what Earth can offer. This is what we need from the Council to make it viable. I'd like to walk you through both. Vascaratha's translator carried the Elder's voice with the careful neutrality that Durrani diplomatic convention required even in moments of visible distress. Admiral, the Council acknowledges that Earth's assessment of the Varith trajectory proved correct. The Council also acknowledges that Earth's preparation was undertaken in good faith, in the absence of Council support. Yes, Vasquez said simply. The Council is prepared to grant Earth Unified Defense Command full operational authority within the Shira Arm and surrounding space for the duration of this crisis. This would be unprecedented. I understand. And would require Earth to accept joint command protocols with Council military assets. Vasquez had expected this. She had also modeled it. The Council's combined military assets were not negligible. They were simply organized around assumptions about the Varith that had proven incorrect. Council warships were designed for deterrence and patrol, not sustained combat against a biological front that didn't respond to deterrence and didn't hold position to be patrolled. The doctrine gap was significant. We can work with Joint Command, she said, provided tactical decisions within the Shira Arm engagement zone are made by Earth commanders using Earth doctrine. Council assets can operate under our coordination, or independently in sectors where our fleet doesn't have coverage. But I need operational clarity. If I'm running this engagement, I need to actually run it. There was a long silence in the chamber. Vasquez looked at the other Council representatives. Some things are communicated across species in ways that translation doesn't fully capture. The particular weight of a collective reluctance being set aside in favor of necessity. Vasquez watched it happen in real time. Agreed, the senior arbiter said. Vasquez opened the first element of her briefing. Then let's talk about what the next 11 weeks look like. The plan she laid out was not simple, but it was coherent, a quality that the Council's military advisors, reviewing it in real time, found unexpectedly reassuring. Earth's doctrine acknowledged limitation. It didn't promise outcomes it couldn't model. It built in contingencies and decision points and thresholds at which the plan would adapt rather than continue in a direction that the data no longer supported. The Varith front, Vasquez explained, would reach the first inhabited system, Kelitha's secondary colony at Sherry 4, in approximately 10 weeks. Sherry 4 had a population of 340,000. It had minimal orbital defense infrastructure and no military garrison. Under conventional analysis, it was indefensible. Earth's approach was not conventional. They were not going to defend Sherry 4. They were going to make reaching Sherry 4 expensive enough to delay the front's advance and, if the biological disruptor weapons performed as modeled, potentially redirect it toward lower-value targets. We're not trying to stop the front, Vasquez said clearly. We're trying to change its cost calculation. The Varith consume what's available and avoid what requires more energy to reach than it provides in return. We make Sherry 4 and the other threatened systems into problems, not opportunities. We buy time. We protect evacuation corridors. We degrade the front's leading nodes to slow the advance. And we look for the pressure point, the biological concentration that, if disrupted, disrupts the front's organizational coherence. You believe such a point exists? Asked the Kelith representative, whose people's colony was 10 weeks away from the leading edge of an entity that had consumed worlds. Ares models it at high probability, Vasquez said. We haven't confirmed it in live engagement data. The Council's historical records don't go into enough tactical detail to verify it. But the biological logic holds. Every distributed intelligence has coordination architecture. We find it and we hit it hard enough to matter. And if your model is wrong? Vasquez looked at the Kelith representative steadily. Then we fall back to the evacuation protocols and we make sure your people are out of the path before the front reaches orbital range. That timeline has already been calculated. The ships are already being positioned. The representative was silent. I'm not going to tell you I can save every world in the front's path, Vasquez said. I don't know if I can. What I can tell you is that Earth is going to commit everything we have to this engagement. We built our defense architecture with this scenario in mind. We're as prepared as any species has ever been to face a Varith front. She paused. I'd also like to say, for the formal record, that I wish the Council had been prepared alongside us. That was what we asked for 14 months ago. Vasquez inclined his head. The gesture carried the weight of an acknowledgement that went beyond diplomatic convention. The record will reflect that, he said. Good, Vasquez said. Now let's save some worlds. The evacuation of Sherry 4 took 9 days. It was not orderly. Evacuations never are. There were 340,000 people on a colony world with civilian transport infrastructure designed for routine intersystem movement, not the mass relocation of an entire population under a deadline that everyone understood but no one wanted to say aloud. The Council contributed 11 transport vessels. Earth contributed 23, including 6 large-capacity colony ships that had been pulled from their regular routes and redirected to Sherry 4 with the kind of prioritization that happens when the alternative is measured in lives. The Keleth Civil Administration cooperated fully. The Keleth military garrison, 2 patrol ships and a ground defense battery that was relevant against conventional threats and nearly irrelevant against what was coming, was integrated into Earth's operational structure and tasked with perimeter security during the evacuation. Captain Park coordinated the evacuation from the Carthage's command center, running on 4 hours of sleep in a 36-hour cycle and maintaining the particular focused calm that she'd learned, over years, was the most useful thing a commander could project when the people around her were operating in controlled fear. The evacuation completed with 11 days remaining before the front's projected arrival at Sherry IV's orbital shell. Park didn't use those 11 days to rest. She used them to prepare. Contingency framework as it applied to Sherry 4 involved a layered response along the front's approach corridor. The first layer was Sentinel data, continuous real-time tracking of the front's leading-edge biological node positions and advanced biomass density. The second layer was the Carthage Battle Group plus 6 additional EUDC vessels that had arrived from Sol in the past 3 weeks, positioned along the approach vector at staggered intervals designed to conduct sequential engagement rather than a single concentrated defense that the front's sheer mass would overwhelm. The third layer was the biological disruptors. Earth's ordnance engineers had built them in 8 months, working from theoretical models of Varith biology derived from the limited samples in Council scientific archives and from Ares's projections of how a biological superorganism would respond to targeted disruption of its nervous system analogs. They were, in the language of the weapons systems documentation, precision-yield biocatalytic delivery platforms. In the language that the Carthage's weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Jana Kowalski, used in the privacy of her department, they were designed to give the Varith a migraine. More precisely, they were designed to disrupt the neurochemical signaling that coordinated the superorganism's biological nodes, to create, in the Varith's distributed intelligence, something analogous to the confusion and disorientation that follows sudden sensory overload. The theoretical models suggested this would cause the front's advance to slow, become disorganized, and potentially shift direction as the biological intelligence sought environments that didn't produce the same disruptive response. The theoretical models had never been tested in actual engagement. Park knew that. Every commander in her battle group knew it. They were going to find out whether 9 years of modeling had produced a weapons system that worked, or an expensive and carefully designed failure. The front reached Sherry IV's outer orbital boundary on a Tuesday. Park watched it arrive on the Carthage's main tactical display, the Sentinel data rendering it in the same false color density map she'd been studying for 3 weeks. Up close, or as close as 600,000 kilometers constituted, the front had a quality that the display didn't quite capture. The Carthage's long-range optical sensors showed it as a vast biological mass, darker than the surrounding space, its surface alive with the slow, purposeful movement of organisms that were each the size of Earth-ocean vessels and that collectively formed an intelligence spanning light-minutes of space. It was, despite everything, remarkable. "Weapons free on my order," Park said. "First salvo. Biological disruptors, targeting coordinates from Ares tactical overlay. I want the node cluster at bearing 274, elevation -12, range 400,000. Targeting confirmed," Kowalski said. "Ready on your order." Park watched the front advance. Watched the Ares system calculate, update, recalculate. Watched the node cluster that the Sentinel data had identified as the leading coordination point of the front, the biological concentration that was, if the model held, the primary intelligence hub organizing the advance toward Sherry 4. "Fire," she said. The Carthage delivered a 16-round salvo of precision biocatalytic weapons toward the target cluster. The transit time at the engagement range was 41 seconds. 41 seconds in which the bridge was almost completely silent except for the background hum of the ship's systems and Kowalski's quiet weapons status updates. The impact registered on the Sentinel data almost immediately. And then, slowly, over the next 8 minutes, something happened that the models had predicted but that still produced an audible reaction from the bridge crew. The node cluster's density signature changed. The biological coherence that the Sentinel sensors measured as a specific electromagnetic and gravitational profile began to shift, fragmenting at the edges, the tight organizational pattern that characterized an active Varith coordination hub dissolving into something less structured. Node cluster is showing disruption response, Zhao reported from the tactical station. Coordination signature is degrading. I'm reading a change in the front's advance vector. The leading edge is decelerating. Park watched the data. How much? 12% deceleration in the approach cone. The flanking elements are maintaining speed, but the leading edge is slowing. It wasn't a stop. It wasn't a retreat. It was a hesitation, a biological flinch from something that had never encountered this kind of targeted disruption before. But in the mathematics of the engagement, 12% deceleration over the approach distance to Sherry 4 meant additional hours. Additional hours meant additional evacuation capacity for the 3 other threatened systems further along the front's path. Additional hours meant more time for the precision targeting to identify the next node cluster, and the next salvo, and the next incremental cost imposed on an entity that had never been made to pay this kind of price for a world it wanted to consume. Second salvo, Park said. Targeting the flank node concentration at bearing 190. Full precision strike package. Ready, Kowalski said. Fire. The engagement at Sherry 4 lasted 9 days. Over those 9 days, the Carthage battle group fired a total of 847 precision biocatalytic weapons at 34 identified node clusters across the front's leading edge. 4 EUDC escort vessels took damage from biological counterattacks. The Varitha's response to sustained engagement was not a directed military assault but a biological saturation, a dense projection of organic matter from the front's surface that had to be intercepted by point defense systems and twice by kinetic fire from the escort ships. The Indus sustained hull damage in the second such exchange and withdrew to a repair position. No crew were lost. The front's advance on Sherry 4 slowed. It did not stop. But when the front's leading edge reached Sherry IV's inner orbital boundary, the colony world was empty. 340,000 people, relocated in 19 days under the most difficult conditions any council evacuation had faced in a generation. And the front, arriving at a world that was biologically barren, stripped of the organized agricultural systems and biological richness that had made it attractive as a consumption target, spent 11 days circling it before its leading elements began, slowly and without elegance, to redirect toward a different vector. Away from the next inhabited system. Not far. Not decisively. But away. Park sent her engagement report to EUDC Command and to the Council simultaneously. The report was detailed, honest about what had worked and what remained uncertain, and contained one sentence at the end that she had written and rewritten until it said exactly what she meant without saying more than she could justify. The engagement at Sherry 4 provides preliminary confirmation that the contingency framework doctrine is operationally viable. Additional engagements will be required to characterize the front's adaptive response and refine targeting protocols. In the Council chamber on Eru Prime, the 11 representatives received the report and read it. For the first time since the emergency session, Vasquez allowed something that the Durrani translation software rendered as cautious optimism to enter the diplomatic register of his official communication to Admiral Vasquez. Vasquez read it, filed it, and went back to work. There were 3 more threatened systems. There was a front that was already adapting to what it had just experienced. There was an Ares system running constant updates on the tactical picture. And the update that had just arrived from Sentinel Station 9 was flagging something new in the front's behavioral data that Vasquez hadn't seen in any of the models. The front wasn't just redirecting. It was reorganizing. The Varith had been consuming worlds for longer than humanity had been building fires. This was not a fact that Earth's strategic planners had overlooked. It was, in fact, central to contingency framework's foundational assumptions. Specifically, the assumption that any tactical approach humanity used would eventually stop working, because the biological intelligence coordinating the front would adapt to it. The question was not whether the Varith would adapt. The question was how fast. The answer arrived through the Sentinel network over a period of 3 weeks following the Sherry 4 engagement, and it was more complicated than any of the pre-engagement models had predicted. The front was adapting but not in a uniform way. The biological nodes that had been targeted by precision biocatalytic weapons were, as expected, reorganizing, the disrupted clusters rebuilding coherence in new configurations that were partially resistant to the original targeting parameters. Earth's weapons team had anticipated some degree of this and had built adaptive recalibration protocols into the disruptor systems, which updated targeting parameters based on observed post-strike node behavior. What hadn't been fully anticipated was the structural change in the front's organization. 3 weeks after HFY 4, Sentinel data showed that the front's node architecture had shifted from a hierarchical concentration model, with large, identifiable coordination hubs, to something more distributed. The big high-value node clusters that had been ideal targets for the precision strikes were breaking up into smaller, more numerous subnodes spread across a wider volume of the front. Each individual subnode was harder to identify, harder to target precisely, and individually less significant to the front's coordination function. In human military terms, it was decentralization as a defensive response. Dr. Hannah Sato, reviewing the Sentinel data in the Carthage's Science Bay, described it in her report to EUDC Command with characteristic precision. The front has not developed a response to our weapons. It has developed a response to our targeting doctrine. It is making itself a harder target, not a tougher one. That distinction had significant tactical implications. The precision biocatalytic approach depended on identifying high-value nodes, concentrations of biological coordination activity significant enough that their disruption produced measurable changes in the front's behavior. If the front eliminated high-value nodes by distributing that function across hundreds of low-value subnodes, then each individual strike became less consequential. The cumulative effect of the weapons remained. The biocatalytic disruption was still occurring at each target, but the organizational disruption that had produced the behavioral change at HFY 4 required hitting a much larger number of targets to achieve the same effect. Earth's weapons stockpile was not unlimited. Vasquez absorbed this problem over 48 hours of continuous analysis with her senior staff, the Ares system, and a newly established joint planning group that included, for the first time, senior military advisors from 4 council species who had committed forces to the engagement under Earth's operational coordination. The solution required a doctrinal shift. Contingency framework had been designed with the flexibility to adapt, and Vasquez invoked that flexibility now. The revised doctrine, which her team informally called Contingency Framework Delta, moved away from precision strikes on individual high-value nodes and toward something more aggressive, targeted area disruption combined with kinetic barrier tactics designed to physically constrain the front's movement options. The kinetic barrier concept was the most operationally complex element of the revised approach. It involved deploying dense fields of kinetic interceptors, essentially very large quantities of precisely positioned mass, along specific corridors in the front's potential approach vectors. The front could physically move through these fields, but doing so required the leading biomass to absorb the kinetic impacts, slowing the advance and generating biological debris that disrupted the front's internal signaling environment. It was not elegant. In the frank assessment of Commander Zhao, who had worked through the concept with the Ares tactical system over 3 days, "We're throwing rocks. Very precisely positioned, very large rocks, delivered at significant expense but still rocks. Does it work?" Vasquez had asked. The model says yes. The model has been right about HFY 4 and wrong about the adaptation timeline. I'd say moderate confidence. That's the best confidence I've had in 2 months, Vasquez said. Do it. The revised approach was implemented across 3 simultaneous engagement zones: the approaches to Keleth Prime, the Surai Research Station Complex, and the uninhabited but resource-rich Dren system, which the Ares analysis suggested the front's redirected elements were using as a biological recovery zone between major advances. Keleth Prime was the political and military priority. It was a core council world with a population of 800 million and the kind of strategic significance, cultural, diplomatic, economic, that made its loss not just a humanitarian catastrophe but potentially an existential blow to the council's coherence as a political entity. Losing a colony at HFY 4 was survivable. Losing Keleth Prime was not. Earth committed 60% of its available Shira armed fleet to the Keleth Prime approach corridor. Council military assets, largely older patrol and escort class vessels that were being reconfigured with Earth-supplied tactical systems as rapidly as the engineering teams could manage, covered the flanking sectors. The engagement at Keleth Prime lasted 6 weeks. It was not a victory in any simple sense. The revised doctrine worked. The kinetic barriers slowed the front's advance. The distributed biocatalytic strikes accumulated enough aggregate disruption to produce measurable behavioral changes, and the front's approach to Keleth Prime was constrained to a narrower corridor than the Sentinel data had initially projected. This made the defense more manageable. But the front was also learning faster than Ares had modeled. By the 3rd week of the Keleth engagement, the front had developed what Sato's team called biological countermeasures: enhanced production of dense organic material along its leading edge that provided additional mass absorption against kinetic impacts. Not armor, exactly, but a biological response that served a similar function. The kinetic barriers remained effective, but required more material to achieve the same result. And in week 5, something happened that wasn't in any model. The front produced a localized directed biological projection, focused organic mass, accelerated outward from the front surface in a coordinated pulse that was functionally, if not mechanically, analogous to a weapon's discharge. It was not a new capability in the Council's historical records. What was new was the precision. Historical Verith projections had been area effects, the biological saturation that had damaged the Indus at Sherry 4. This was targeted. It targeted the Carthage. The pulse hit the Carthage's port side at a velocity and density that the point defense system hadn't been configured to handle. The ship absorbed the impact across her hull and lost 3 of her portside weapons batteries, a section of her drive manifold, and 7 crew members who were in the affected compartments when the biological matter breached the hull. 7 people. Park stood in the Combat Information Center as damage control teams worked through the ship, and she felt what she always did in those moments, the particular weight of names that would need to be written into reports, of notifications that would be sent, of the precise cost of the distance between a model's predictions and what actually happens when you point a weapon system at something that has been alive for longer than your civilization. She stood with it for 60 seconds. Then she turned back to the tactical display. Reconfigure point defense for biological pulse intercept. Get me updated targeting parameters from Ares. And tell Zhao I want options for a precision strike on whatever biological structure is producing that pulse. Aye, ma'am. And get me a channel to Admiral Vasquez. Vasquez received Park's damage report and the Sentinel data on the directed pulse capability simultaneously. She looked at both for a long time. Then she looked at the front's current position relative to Keleth Prime. 6 weeks of engagement. The front had slowed. It had redirected partially. But it was still advancing and it was adapting, and the gap between what Earth's doctrine could achieve and what it needed to achieve was not closing fast enough. She made a decision that she had been holding in reserve, that contingency framework had designated as the threshold option, the one that Ares had rated as high impact, high risk, and dependent on information she didn't yet have. It was time to find the pressure point. Not a node cluster. Not a coordination hub. The biological architecture at the center of this front, whatever served as its deepest organizational core. The thing that, if disrupted precisely enough and hard enough, would change not just the front's behavior but its fundamental orientation. If it existed. Ares, she said to the tactical system. Run the core architecture search on everything we've collected since Sherry 4. All Sentinel data. All engagement telemetry. All biological sampling from the kinetic impacts. Full spectrum analysis. I want the highest probability location of the front's primary coordination structure. The Ares system processed for 11 minutes. Then it returned a result that Vasquez hadn't expected. The primary coordination architecture wasn't at the front's leading edge, or in the flanking mass, or in the biological recovery elements at the Dren system. It was 3 light hours behind the front. Moving slowly. Protected by the mass of the front itself. So deep in the biological superorganism's body that no engagement to date had come anywhere near it. And now that she knew where it was, the question was whether she had anything that could reach it. There is a specific kind of mission planning that happens when every option has a significant probability of failure and the most credible path forward requires something no one has ever attempted before. It is not dramatic from the outside. It looks like people sitting around a table with displays, talking through numbers and contingencies and voices that are careful and exact. It looks like a problem being solved. Which is what it is. The problem, as Vasquez laid it out for the Joint Planning Group on the 5th of February 2221, was this. The Ares system had identified a biological structure 3 light hours behind the front's current position that carried a high probability designation as the front's primary coordination architecture. Disrupting this structure, the Ares model assessed at 68% confidence, would produce cascading organizational failure in the front's distributed intelligence, reducing its effective coordination to levels that would force a multi-month biological recovery period. During that recovery period, the front's advance would stop. The biological nodes would become disorganized. The Council worlds in the Shira arm would have time to strengthen their defenses and complete the evacuations of any remaining at-risk populations. 68% confidence. Not certainty. But a better number than anything else on the table. The obstacle was the 3 light hours of Verith biomass between Earth's fleet and the target. The Carthage could not fight through it. No single ship could. The front's mass was measured in planetary units, organic matter that had consumed multiple biospheres and incorporated that mass into its own body. Engaging it conventionally would destroy any attacking force before it reached the target. The solution that Ares proposed, and that Vasquez's team spent 4 days refining, was the kind of thing that sounds simple in retrospect and is only possible when you have spent years building the infrastructure to support it. It was called Deep Charge. 3 EUDC deep penetration vessels, small, highly automated, built for exactly this kind of long-range insertion mission, would enter the front's body not through the leading edge, but through the biological mass on the front's trailing boundary. The front's trailing edge was the oldest part of its body, the biological material that had been processed, consumed, and incorporated earliest, which the Sentinel data showed had the lowest active coordination density. It was still Verith. It would still resist intrusion. But it was the biological equivalent of scar tissue rather than living tissue, less responsive, less organized. The 3 vessels would navigate through the trailing mass using real-time Sentinel guidance, avoiding the highest density biological concentrations, moving toward the target coordinate where Ares had located the primary coordination architecture. They would carry the most powerful biological disruptor payloads that Earth's ordnance capacity could produce. Weapons that the engineering team had spent the last 8 weeks building specifically for this mission, scaled up from the precision strike versions to something closer to an area effect, designed to deliver maximum biocatalytic disruption to the largest possible volume of biological coordination tissue. If they reached the target. If the target was where Ares said it was. If the disruption produced the cascade the model predicted. The risk was real and specific. The 3 ships and their automated crews, each vessel carried a crew of 12, all volunteers, would be inside the front's body for approximately 70 hours. Communications would be severely degraded by the biological mass surrounding them. They would be operating largely on preloaded Ares guidance with periodic burst updates when communication windows opened. If something went wrong inside, there was no rescue possible. The mission commanders were Lieutenant Commander Yara Osei of the Persistent, Lieutenant Commander Tomas Rivas of the Argent, and Commander Xin Zhao of the Shallows River, Park's tactical officer, who had requested the command personally in a meeting with Park that had lasted approximately 90 seconds before Park had approved it with the directness that had always characterized how she handled requests that were grounded in competence and genuine commitment. The 3 ships entered the front's trailing boundary at 0400 on February 19. The Carthage battle group maintained a constant stream of Sentinel updates to the insertion corridors, illuminating the density map as clearly as the sensor network could manage from outside the front's body. Inside, the 3 vessels navigated by that map and by their own short-range biological sensors, choosing paths through the mass that offered the lowest resistance while maintaining the heading toward the target coordinate. It was not clean navigation. The biological environment was dynamic. The front's mass shifted and moved in patterns that the Sentinel data could only approximate from the outside. 3 times in the first 20 hours, one of the vessels had to stop, hold position, and wait for a density concentration to move before continuing. The Argent took biological contact damage on its hull during the second holding period, not a directed attack, simply the front's ambient biological activity pressing against a foreign object that had inserted itself into its body. The damage was manageable. Rivas reported it in a burst communication with the characteristic economy of language that deep mission commanders tend to develop. Hull contact, compartments 7 to 9. Managing. Continuing on heading. Park read the burst on the Carthage's bridge and said nothing. The Persistent, Argent, and Shallows River reached the target coordinate 61 hours and 40 minutes after insertion. Ares had been right. The biological structure at the target coordinate was unlike anything the Sentinel sensors had been able to fully characterize from outside the front. Inside, at close range, the 3 vessels' biological sensors painted a picture that Sato, receiving the data burst in the Carthage's science bay, later described in her report as architecturally coherent in a way that no other structure in the front's body resembles. Dense, organized, with a coordination signature that is orders of magnitude more active than the surrounding mass. It was the center. The deep intelligence. The biological architecture that had been coordinating the front's movements, adaptations, and responses for the entirety of the engagement. Osei sent the targeting confirmation to the other 2 ships. The burst also reached the Carthage, and Park related to EUDC Command and to the Council Joint Command Center on Eru Prime. Then she looked at the display and waited. Inside the front, 3 ships discharged their full weapons payloads simultaneously. The biocatalytic disruption weapons delivered their effect across a volume of biological tissue that encompassed the target coordinate and a surrounding radius calculated to maximize cascade potential. The Sentinel sensors, watching from outside, registered the event as a sudden and dramatic change in the electromagnetic signature emanating from deep within the front's body, a change that had no precedent in the 9 years of data that the Ares system had collected. For 37 minutes, nothing visible happened at the front's surface. Then, slowly and then faster, and then in a way that the Sentinel density maps rendered as a cascading wave moving outward from the front center toward its edges, the organizational coherence of the front began to change. The node signatures shifted. The coordination patterns that had been driving the advance toward Keleth Prime, that had been adapting, responding, directing the front through months of engagement, began to fragment. Not disappear. Not collapse. Fragment. Break into disconnected biological activity that was still alive, still present, but no longer organized into the directed intelligence that had been advancing toward inhabited worlds. The front's leading edge, still pressing toward Keleth Prime when the cascade began, slowed. Stopped. Began, over the next 48 hours, to move in multiple directions simultaneously, individual biological elements following local gradients rather than coordinated direction, the way water spreads when a dam is removed rather than continuing in the channel it was flowing through. The 3 deep penetration vessels navigated out of the trailing edge of the now disorganized front 60 hours after weapons discharge. The Argent required assistance from a Carthage escort to clear the final section of the trailing mass, which had shifted configuration during the disorganization cascade. All crew survived. Rivas sustained a minor injury during the hull contact event that had never appeared in his burst communications, which Park noted in the after-action review with the specific quality of professional irritation that commanders reserve for people who downplay injuries they consider minor. Zhao received her like that when the Shallows River docked. She looked tired and very clear-eyed and entirely herself. "It worked," she said. "It worked," Park confirmed. Ares' probability was 68%. "Yes." Zhao considered this. "Better than I expected." "I know," Park said. "Don't tell Ares. It'll affect the calibration." The front did not immediately disperse. The Sentinel data over the following weeks showed a biological mass that was present, alive and slowly reorganizing, but reorganizing from a fundamentally different state than it had been in before deep charge. Without the primary coordination architecture, the front's distributed nodes were operating locally rather than collectively. The Shira arm worlds that had been in the approach corridor were no longer in immediate danger. The biological recovery period that Ares had projected was playing out. The Galactic Council issued its formal statement 3 days after the front's advance stopped. It was a long statement. It covered the emergency session authorization, the joint operational command arrangement, the engagement at Sherry 4, the defense of Keleth Prime, and the deep charge operation. It was careful and thorough and expressed, in the measured language of Council diplomatic convention, something that those who knew the Council well understood was extraordinary, genuine, unqualified acknowledgement of debt. The Council acknowledged that Earth's warning, submitted 14 months prior to the front's arrival in the Shira arm, had been correct. The Council acknowledged that Earth's defense preparation, undertaken without Council support following the rejection of that warning, had been instrumental in the survival of 4 Council-protected worlds and the prevention of casualties estimated at over 1 billion lives. The Council acknowledged that the tactical doctrine developed by Earth Unified Defense Command had produced results that exceeded any comparable effort in the Council's 3,000-year military history. And the Council, formally and by unanimous vote of all 11 member species, offered Earth full membership status. Not observer. Not candidate. Full member. With a vote. Vasquez received the notification in her command center on the Carthage. She read it once, set it down, and looked out the viewport at the space where the front had been, still hazed with biological material that the Sentinel sensors were tracking as it slowly dispersed and reorganized. Ambassador Brennan, reading the same notification on Eru Prime, sent Vasquez a single line. They asked. Vasquez replied with 2 words. We answered. Somewhere in the dispersed remnants of the front, the biological intelligence that had consumed a dozen worlds was rebuilding itself. Slowly. Without the coordination architecture that had made it what it was for the millennia before February 2221. Adapting as it had always adapted to the environment it found itself in. An environment that had turned out to contain humanity. The Sentinel network watched it. Ares ran its models. Earth kept building. Because the universe, as humanity had learned over and over and in ways that never quite lost their weight, doesn't stop being itself just because you've survived one part of it. It just keeps going. And so do you.